And hello for everyone. I'm glad to see you, and I'm very glad to have our guest from over the sea where the sun is still shining. So we have David Jones and Kathryn Olivarius and Shio Shmueli, who brought them to us, or talked with them, and they were willing to come to us, and we are very happy for that. She will introduce them and also introduce the discussion. And so you know how we are continuing regularly. So please, Shira.
Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to introduce you to our two speakers, David Jones and Kathryn Olivarius, for discussing what we might term the second wave of analysis of the COVID-19 in the humanities. Kathryn Olivarius is an assistant professor of history at Stanford University. She specializes in 19th century America and interested primarily in the antebellum South, Greater Caribbean, slavery, and disease. She holds a BA in history from the Yale University, MSc in US history, and DPhil in history from the University of Oxford. Before joining the Stanford faculty, she was a past and present postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Historical Research at the University of London. Her most recent paper, Immunity, Capital, and Power in Antebellum New Orleans, was published in 2019 by the American Historical Review. Olivarius' forthcoming book is entitled Necropolis, Disease, Power, and Capitalism in the Cotton Kingdom. David Jones is a A. Bernard Ackerman Professor of the Culture of Medicine at the Department of the History of Science at Harvard. Jones completed his BA at Harvard University, History and Science, and then pursued a PhD in History of Science at Harvard University and an MD at Harvard Medical School. After an internship in pediatrics at Children's Hospital and Boston Medical Center, he trained as a psychiatrist at Massachusetts General Hospital and McLean Hospital, and then worked as a staff psychiatrist in the Psychiatric Emergency Service at Cambridge Hospital. Jones was an assistant professor at MIT before joining Harvard. Jones had published numerous papers. His first book, Rationalizing Epidemics, Meaning and the Uses of American Indian Mortality Since 1600, was published by Harvard University Press in 2004. In 2013, Jones published Broken Hearts, the Tangled History of Cardiac Care with Johns Hopkins University Press. Kathryn and David, thanks again for joining us today. We'll start with Kathryn with her presentation first, and then we'll have David responding and sharing his own thoughts about the issues of that we're going to discuss today: immunology, immunoprivilege, and herd immunity. Thank you, Kathryn.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen, and let me just make sure this actually works. Does that work?
Yes, that works.
Excellent. Okay, so thank you for having me. I'm sad that we can't be together in person. I was telling my colleagues that I'm going to be giving a talk in Tel Aviv today, and it sounds much more cosmopolitan and exciting than, of course, being over Zoom. So I'm going to talk about two concepts today, that immunocapital and immunoprivilege, that I have developed in the course of my own historical work, ideas that have resurrected in the political discourse and culture today, especially in the United States. So let's start with a broad overview of the coronavirus pandemic in the American situation today. So we are now 9 months into the coronavirus pandemic that has claimed the lives of 250,000 Americans and infected over 11 million people, disproportionately people of color. So in the last week, we have broken the record for the highest number of cases, new cases reported almost every day of last week. We are now at about 159,000 cases and new infections per day. Doctors are petrified by this surge. Many hospitals are at or past capacity for beds and ventilators. So as I sit from my home office, a room that I seldom leave anymore, it is clear that all of our lives have changed considerably. I remain nervous, of course, for the health of my friends and family. And time itself has sort of moved like very stressful molasses. And while I'm extremely heartened to hear some very promising news on the vaccine front, and remember this data, even the new data from just a few hours ago, it's still very early and not yet peer-reviewed. So I think I speak for many people, despite this very good news, when I say that I'm exhausted. And this goes beyond sort of mere pandemic fatigue. It's an exhaustion and exasperation with the politicization of this pandemic, a politicization that has made the pandemic deadlier, and a politicization that has a long and dark history. So what do I mean by this? So Americans tend to approach this crisis in one of two ways, refracted through the lens of partisanship. So the first viewpoint, held by almost all medical and public health professionals, sees the minimization of death as the paramount goal of the government's response. This group in general has advocated for temporary sort of science-driven restructuring of society in which individual rights are temporarily subordinated for the good of the collective. So this group sees the medical and economic crises gripping the United States and larger world as inextricably linked, and argues that the economy will only improve if and when we control the virus. So sort of animated by the guiding principle of risk reduction, then people of this persuasion advocate for widespread mask wearing, remote working where possible, social distancing, absentee voting, and lockdowns when necessary. Now, the second viewpoint, the one that I'm going to focus on today, holds that significant death during the pandemic is inevitable and acceptable. So essentially they say people die all the time from car crashes or from drug addictions or from the flu. So we shouldn't stop people from living in the present to prevent them from dying. So they argue the public health crisis and the economic crisis are separate, and that shutting down the economy has no salutary effect and indeed makes everything worse. And this position is easy to understand and sympathize with in part, at least in part. It's extremely hard to swallow watching one's business collapse or one's savings dwindle or not being able to visit family far away. But the extreme end of this group, which finds its greatest champions in the White House itself, takes these ideas to their sort of most mercenary, individualist and cynical ends. So this group, this extreme end, looks with skepticism on established and accepted science and say that the virus is a hoax, at least some people do, a conspiracy concocted by China or by the Democratic Party in the United States to undercut our current president, Donald Trump. So many people in this camp cling to disease denialism, or even sort of brandishing this kind of know-nothingism as a kind of ideology or symbol of patriotism. So for many months, Trump appeared to approach the disease without seriousness or without vigor. He declined to wear a mask or follow basic social distancing guidelines. He tweeted about liberating states and promoted discredited therapies. So pulling from the playbook of climate change denialists, I think pulling from the playbook of climate change denialists, Trump has cast doubt on statistics. This summer, he is, as he said, that the rising cases only reflected increased testing, not new cases. He claimed that the number of deaths had been doctored and that COVID wasn't all that lethal. So at the first presidential debate, Trump made fun of now President-elect Joe Biden for his consistent mask wearing, and then Trump himself became sick. And some people were hopeful that his own infection would pop the bubble, as it were, as it did for Prime Minister of Britain, Boris Johnson. But from the hospital, Trump instead tweeted that the coronavirus was not that bad. He insisted that in sickness that he felt better and healthier than he had in 20 years. Then he railed against government scientists, dubbing them as idiots or seditious traitors. And he called Anthony Fauci, America's top infectious disease expert, a disaster. Then Trump and others started pushing a certain line. They said this, that in getting sick, Trump was actually a patriot, that he had to do it for the good of the country. His communications director, in fact, actually faulted Joe Biden for not contracting the coronavirus, arguing that Trump was stronger for having gotten sick, that he was, quote, now he has the experience fighting the virus as an individual. Those firsthand experiences, Joe Biden, he doesn't have those. So I could give a dozen examples of Trump downplaying the virus and his team brandishing his recovery as not just a medical victory, but a moral one. So the scary aspect of this disease denialism, however, is that he has actively encouraged Americans to embrace infection, risk their lives and the lives of others to reopen the economy. So his administration has de facto embraced a policy pursuing herd immunity, so letting the virus run its course unimpeded. In this view, the government has no responsibility to keep people healthy during the worst public health crisis in a century. It's going away, Trump has promised at the final presidential debate during a new surge. He says, we have to open our country. And one day, he said, like a miracle, it will be gone. Now, while I find this rhetoric dangerous and unscientific and distasteful, I don't find it particularly shocking because the exact same political, rhetorical, and social patterns around disease and risk and personal responsibility and disease denialism existed in the American Deep South 2 centuries ago. So only the disease that was politicized then was far more deadly than COVID. This disease was yellow fever. So in the 19th century, Deep South, and especially in New Orleans, the major hub of the Cotton Kingdom and the nation's largest slave trading port, the mosquito-borne virus yellow fever routinely ravaged the population and reached epidemic proportions every 2 or 3 years in the summertime. Now, each summer, about 8% of the population died from yellow fever. Society was upended as thousands fled the region in panic. Countless more people were left orphaned, widowed, and bereaved. The 1853 epidemic killed over 12,000 people in New Orleans alone in the course of about 2.5 months, making it one of the worst natural disasters in U.S. history. In total, yellow fever killed about 250,000 people in New Orleans during the 19th century. Now, yellow fever was so petrifying as so little was known about it. There was no cure, there was no inoculation, there was no vaccination. There was no conclusive evidence of disease transmission. They did not know that it was spread by mosquitoes until the very end of the 19th century. And there was no satisfactory evidence for why it killed some while sparing others. Moreover, it was a sudden and horrible way to die, with victims famously vomiting up this partly sort of coagulated blood, roughly the consistency and color of coffee grounds at the very end of their illness. It was so painful that even pious victims screamed profanities as the end neared. Now, the luckiest people contracted milder, sort of flu-like cases in childhood, but overall, 19th century victims had around a 50% chance of dying if they contracted yellow fever. The other, luckier half became acclimated or immune for life. They called it acclimated or acclimation. Now, the elites of this society, so the white cotton planters, the sugar planters, the merchants, the bankers, the politicians, they came to accept that yellow fever was a situation that could not be fixed, that it wasn't going to go away. New Orleans, for those who have been there, sits at the base of the Mississippi River in a pestilential swamp at about 1 foot above sea level. Yet New Orleans was so geopolitically and economically important to the United States and to individuals' wealth that it could not just be given up despite its ecological limitations. So to make the Cotton Kingdom work, you need to have a city here, a sort of depot of sorts, to handle the mountains of cotton and sugar grown by slaves that were produced in the Mississippi Valley. And these commodities, these industries required people to make them work, lots of them. So lots of people who were both free and enslaved in their model. So they had to encourage mass immigration to keep the wheels of this extremely lucrative region rolling. Now, the good news, if you could call it that, was that yellow fever survivors became immune. Now, deep Southerners did not understand much about immunity. They euphemized it as acclimation or creolization or seasoning. But they did have a crude grasp on the fact that surviving the disease was perhaps paradoxically the only way to survive long term. So with this knowledge that survivors were safe, Orleans adapted to their fatal environment and generated an invisible epidemiological hierarchy, which commingled with and exacerbated the racial hierarchy of whites, free blacks, and enslaved people. So here, so-called acclimated citizens, these are survivors of yellow fever, were at the top of civic and commercial life. This group was followed by so-called unacclimated strangers, these people who were in this kind of probationary period awaiting their brush with disease. And this group was followed by the dead, who in the local logic, this is a group without sufficient bravery or morality to survive. Now, the problem was that acclimation was definitionally vague. Yellow fever does not leave physical scars upon survivors, and not everyone experienced the telltale symptom of black vomit. Moreover, leading physicians did not agree that yellow fever was a discrete illness, and they frequently misdiagnosed it as malaria, another disease that was endemic to the American Deep South. So, consequently, there was a ton of misinformation and rumor surrounding the acclimation question. Now, some doctors said that a person was acclimated if they had lived in New Orleans for 6 years without interruption. Others said that it required actually surviving yellow fever. Some assumed that children, if they survived to the age of 5, were immune. And it was likewise assumed that Creoles, so this is a class of the population that was born, these are people born and raised in Louisiana or somewhere else in the tropics. Some people assumed that they were immune as a kind of birthright. But these are a lot of assumptions with life and death consequences that were impossible to verify without diagnostic blood testing. So as novelist and steamboat captain Mark Twain put it, acclimation was a highly sensitive and deeply personal topic on which, quote, no two persons exactly agreed. So in the high risk, low information context of the 19th century New Orleans, immunity was invisible and performative, a matter of faith as much as fact. But people performed their immunity as best as they could because they wanted to wield what I call immunocapital, which is socially acknowledged acclimation. So they did this. They performed their immunity because with immunocapital, white people were provided access to previously inaccessible realms of social, economic, and political power. So, in fact, most young men steeled themselves to follow the advice of the Picayune, the sort of flagship newspaper of New Orleans, which said, quote, if a man intends to make himself a citizen of New Orleans, his first duty is to become acclimated. He owes it to himself and society. Now, immunity really mattered. Unacclimated people were ostracized as social and economic pariahs. They could not get jobs. They could not get life insurance. They could not get credit. Banks would not lend to them. They could not marry certain people, and they could not socialize in certain circles. And very often they were barred from voting, disenfranchised. So, and on the other side of disease, Orleans described acclimation like being reborn. As one newspaper declared in 1853, the acclimated man walked the streets with a, quote, tremendously bold swagger, sneering at the unacclimated who darted about timidly and nervously. The acclimated man pooh-poohed yellow fever and called it a mere nothing. Or, put in another way by one Connecticut immigrant who boasted after he had survived yellow fever, quote, victory had perched upon my banner. I was an acclimated citizen and as such received into full favor in the good city of New Orleans, where they distrust everybody until they become endorsed by the yellow fever. Later, Orleanians would boast of the year of their acclimation, so 1817 or 1833 or 1849, like a membership badge and an invisible fraternity of disease survivors. Some would even celebrate their acclimations like an anniversary with a yearly feast. Now, considering all of the impediments faced by the unacclimated, even Dr. Edward Hall Barton, who was the president of the 1841 Board of Health in New Orleans, suggested that, quote, the value of acclimation is worth the risk. So, if the difference between stigma and privilege was surviving a disease, it is no wonder that people actively sought sickness. So I have seen examples of newcomers arriving in New Orleans, fresh off of the boat, having descended the Mississippi River, and the first thing they do is they inject black vomit into their veins, or they eat it, or they will hop into the bed of their friend who has just died from yellow fever, and they will roll around in the bed sheets hoping to get sick. Remember that this is a disease to which you have a 50-50 chance of surviving. So people are actively taking on extreme disease risk. So let's look at a couple of examples of how deeply immunity, this immunity calculus penetrated this already deeply unequal society by conferring or eroding privilege. So I have a million other examples of this that I can raise in the Q&A, and I have a few ones curated here. So first, let's look at employment. So, seeking to capitalize on their hard-earned immunity, whether real or imagined, white job seekers filled newspapers with personal declarations of acclimation. So one clerk enumerated his credentials in this order: well acclimated, well educated, speaking 5 languages with the best of references, notable integrity, and business capacities. A middle-aged man claimed that he was, quote, well acquainted with the city and also well acclimated between the latitudes of 32 degrees and the tropics. Employers often demanded parental residency in New Orleans, proof of local birth, or else a physician's letter certifying acclimation. Now, from the boss's perspective, it was a waste of resources to train someone for a detail-oriented job only to see him stricken or dead by the autumn. As one unemployed German immigrant named Gustav Dressel lamented in the 1830s, quote, "I looked around in vain for a position as a bookkeeper, but to engage a young man who was not acclimated would be a bad speculation." Now, amid this fatal churn, acclimated men could parlay immunity into raises and greater responsibility with the managerial classes of merchant houses, wholesalers, and groceries composed almost entirely of white men claiming immunity. One cotton clerk named H.J. Masson remarked that the 1837 epidemic was the worst in living memory, having ravaged the unacclimated population considerably and thinning the counting houses. So consequently, Masson said, there was considerable demand for entry-level clerks. So after a competing factor, a man named Mr. Stringer lost his clerk to fever. Stringer was very anxious for the acclimated Masson to quit his job and join him. Now, even after rigorous acclimation screening, employees still died in droves. As one traveler noted after the epidemic of 1836, quote, "5 perished out of one counting house. Another house buried their bookkeeper, employed another, buried him, and employed a third before the dead season had passed." Now, such mortality among the allegedly immune suggests that clerks either misjudged their immunity or that they willfully lied about it. Now, this was a high-risk lie. False declarations of acclimation merited termination. It was taken as an unimpeachable sign of untrustworthiness. But many people apparently believed that the lie was worth it. They would feign ignorance and then worry about surviving disease later. Now, in time, surviving yellow fever evolved into a sort of moral and patriotic act, with a successful brush with yellow fever becoming the quintessential demonstration of calculated risk-taking in this marketplace, that a white man had willingly gambled his life and had paid his biological dues. Now, all elites factored successful acclimations into their genesis stories. So though he could have fled in the summer of 1801, for example, one 18-year-old Irish immigrant named Monsell White remained, realizing, quote, "Alas, there was no help for it but to take my chance." Now, reminiscing many decades later, White recalled his acclimation as a major life turning point. So with only an informal education, he progressed quickly from bookkeeping to running his own cotton factory, to sugar planting, to politicking, and he in fact died one of the richest men in America. Now, all of this he attributed, at least in part, to his acclimation. So, like all the most powerful white Orleanians, White framed his acclimation as a choice, that he had decided to contract yellow fever and that he had willed himself to survive. So, in this logic, lesser men literally chose to die because they were drunkards, because they were effeminate, because they were sexually deviant, because they were cowardly or unpatriotic or unclean, or because they did not seek timely medical care. Now, distilling the randomness of life and death to a matter of individual choice fed into this sort of myth of meritocratic capitalism, that all white people of sufficient moral and physical courage had the potential for survival and success in New Orleans, that economic and social success was the result of a man's willingness to take on controlled epidemiological risk. Now, never mind that this sunny vision of yellow fever clashed with the fatal reality. The cold facts of disease risk, that half of all victims would die, mattered little. The myth of immunological reward proved far more powerful. Thus, while epidemics raged, young men then, just as they do now, routinely touted aspirational mantras about human agency over disease, insisting that yellow fever was a mild ailment, boasting that they had never enjoyed better health, and reassuring family that they would succeed where others had failed. Now, such optimism may have been self-delusional, but most unacclimated migrants bought into immunocapital and the hierarchy that it created, believing that the system would benefit them eventually. After all, immunological discrimination was just one more form of bias in a city essentially premised on inequality. Now, the logic, of course, could easily slip into exploitation and abuses. Now, recruited directly off the boat, thousands of Irishmen built the new Basin Canal in the 1830s. Working in ghastly conditions, between 6,000 and 10,000 Irishmen died of yellow fever while digging the 4-mile stretch of the canal. But the bosses did not blink an eye at this. They actually preferred a labor model that focused on replacing the dead rather than keeping employees alive, because high turnover cost them nothing. It also impeded laborers' ability to organize and demand better pay, conditions, and rights. Now, these ideas about epidemiology, about bodies, and value came to exist in New Orleans because city officials essentially threw up their hands in the face of yellow fever. Now, New Orleans had no competent institutions tasked with tracking or defining disease. Boards of health came and went. Unpaved streets stank with stagnant water and night soil and rotting animals. Quarantines routinely buckled under pressure from the business community. And outside the charity hospital, the city had few places for poor victims of disease to receive care. Now, even in the larger Southern context, New Orleans invested significantly less money into ameliorating disease-related problems than other cities. So in 1850, for example, New Orleans spent just 4 cents per person per year on public health, compared with 69 cents in Boston. By the way, so it's sort of nonsensical perhaps that the nation's deadliest city, with triple the national mortality average, spent the least in terms of public health. Most Orleanians resigned themselves to the fact that their government took essentially no action to combat yellow fever, no sanitation, no sewering, no quarantines. Now, perhaps the priorities of the commercial civic elite would have differed had they worried that mass death would undercut their sort of specific vision of commodity enslaved capitalism. But these elites, they themselves were already immune, or at least they pretended to be. And in this manufacturing-averse and labor-rich city where thousands of Black people were auctioned each season, and every ship brought in fresh white bodies from Ireland and Germany to replace the dead, there was no shortage of labor. Now, whether defeated by disease or defiantly deaf to their constituents' needs, most politicians came to embrace the philosophy that the only effective long-term solution to epidemic yellow fever was not public health, but paradoxically, more yellow fever. Expensive water pumps and quarantines only delayed the inevitable. Now, the elite culture of apathetic fatalism ran very deep. Even at the height of epidemics, the city council barely discussed disease. Instead, it preoccupied itself with finances and zoning and bread weights. Pursuing solutions to the yellow fever problem was considered to be a sort of poor use of political capital, and there were essentially no negative consequences for politicians who avoided the disease question. So in 1820, property requirements barred nearly 60% of white men from voting in New Orleans. Now, excluding so many white males while also excluding women, free Black people, enslaved people, recent immigrants, and children meant that only a very small proportion of the city's residents held politicians accountable. So luckily for politicians, those inhabitants who clamored for public health infrastructure quieted over time as they accepted the filthiness of the urban condition, or gained immunity, or they fled, or they died. And as naturalization required 5 years of residence, there was a strong overlap between the non-acclimated, the non-propertied, and the non-citizen. And figuring that a large percentage would die before becoming enfranchised citizens, politicians found the unacclimated an easy block to ignore. After all, dead men did not vote, acclimated men did. Now, demonstrating how little concern they had for their constituents, most politicians quit the city during epidemics. Baron Fontalba, who was the last colonial governor of Louisiana, the Spanish governor of Louisiana in the 18th century, related that he and a party had fled the city in 1796 because it was too melancholy during the epidemic. And so at his plantation outside of the city, they banned all talk of death and started drinking. And it seems sort of somewhat reminiscent of Boccaccio's 10 fleeing the ravages of the Black Death. Now, political absenteeism during epidemics was the norm, and it crippled the function of government. So in the autumn of 1804, a season in which between 1,000 and 1,500 people died, 7 meetings of the city council were canceled because no city councilors showed up. And in 1853, the year of the city's worst epidemic, with about 12,000 deaths, politicians fled before passing any kind of appropriation bill for public health. Now, yellow fever also factored heavily into election scheduling, with politicians routinely jockeying to schedule local and state elections for early September, the moment when unacclimated people were most likely to have fled town or else were too sick or scared to vote. Now, Bernard Marigny, who was one of the richest and most powerful men in Louisiana, a massive sugar planter, he submitted during the state's constitutional convention in 1845 that scheduling elections to take place during epidemics was acceptable because, quote, no good citizen was afraid of yellow fever. Rather, acclimation was the baptism of citizenship, offering a guarantee of devotion to the country. So, with politicians' intent to avoid or exploit the yellow fever problem, most people quickly accepted the harsh reality that public health was private acclimation. Now, remember that the Deep South was a slave society. So here is the most important way that humans manipulated unthinking biology for unequal and white supremacist ends. Now, white Southerners took as axiomatic that Black people were less affected by yellow fever than white people. Now, physicians and sextons repeatedly emphasized the lower death rates of Black people from yellow fever, suggesting, for instance, that only 3 Black people died from yellow fever in New Orleans in 1849, as compared with almost 800 white people. Dr. Josiah Nott, who was a very famous pro-slavery theorist, posited that, quote, Negro blood is an antidote against yellow fever, for the smallest admixture of it with the white will protect against this disease. And Dr. Samuel Cartwright, another one of the most famous pro-slavery theorists in America, said that Black people were, quote, perfect non-conductors of yellow fever. And everyone in the medical and political community publicly echoed these words. Now, modern epidemiologists, however, have discovered no mechanism for so-called hereditary resistance to yellow fever as they have for malaria. So in short, the theory of natural Black immunity is not true. There's no epidemiological basis for it. But this did not stop pro-slavery theorists from doubling down on it. They argued that yellow fever resistance was racialized and that God had made Black people immunologically superior specifically so that they would be enslaved in the American South on a massive scale. And because of this special God-given immunity, as they called it, white people argued that Black people should do all sorts of labor in dangerous and diseased spaces. So the city levee, the docklands, sugar fields. Labor that they claimed would otherwise kill white people. So immunity thus signaled in this pro-slavery logic that slavery was a scientific destiny for Black people. And immunity was construed in all sorts of very strange and increasingly weird ways. In 1853, for example, one newspaper argued that as divine punishment, Black people lost their natural resistance to yellow fever in freedom, and therefore that slavery was the best condition suited to Black people. Another article maintained that the only people who died of yellow fever were abolitionists. Now, such thinking, of course, was nothing short of alchemy. And despite the pious professions about enslaved people's natural immunity, no white enslaver would buy a person without an express guarantee of acclimation. So, like fancy or likely or choice, acclimated was a common descriptor in slave sale advertisements, a euphemism that conveniently reduced a person's suffering to a marketable asset. Now, acclimated slaves commanded higher prices, between 25 and 50% more. Now, like everything else in the slave market, acclimation status was a guess. But a white person's ability to judge it was considered a sign of mastery, cunning, and intelligence, that a white man could read another person's body and discern its maximum value. Now, enslaved people, of course, probably did not see their immunity as an asset or capitalist calculation in the same way that white people did. Petrified of yellow fever, like everybody else, enslaved people could not flee or afford expensive doctors independently. And they did not have the option of not taking on disease risk. And if immunity could save their lives and constitute a sort of key aspect of an enslaved person's sort of personal self-worth and identity, it added nothing to their personal wealth or social standing. As slaves were embodied capital, acclimation only enhanced the value and safety of that capital for their white owners. Now, by the 1820s, many whites considered New Orleans too risky for their expensive enslaved property. So even if a slave was declared acclimated, fraud was very common, as slave traders routinely fabricated backstories to enhance a person's value and hasten a sale. And with tens of thousands of poor, famine-fleeing Irishmen pouring onto the docks by the 1840s, the labor calculus shifted. Now, the proportion of enslaved persons in the city, therefore, dropped from about 50% in 1806 to under 25% in 1840 to just 8% in 1860. So capitalist needs essentially pushed acclimated slaves into surrounding plantations, safer, less diseased spaces that were more efficient sites for Black people to create more capital for white people. So I'll conclude with just a few points that marry the past and the present. So in the 19th century, surviving yellow fever was classed as an indication of moral superiority for white men. As one Orleanian congratulated his convalescent friend, quote, "He had finally succeeded in getting out his naturalization papers. He is now in every respect a citizen of New Orleans, and long may he live to enjoy the glorious privilege." Now, those white people at the top of New Orleans' economic and political life, these are all allegedly yellow fever survivors. These elites obtained a sort of de facto moral legitimacy, a tropical, if ecumenical twist on Max Weber's aristocracy of the elect. Now, in their public willingness to roll the epidemiological dice and risk their lives, they had been endowed with both a practical and moral right to thrive in slave racial capitalism, a system that they classified as a harsh but essentially honest meritocracy. Now, these same elites, of course, colluded to invert this logic of immunocapital for Black people who were denied the benefits of immunity, with their immunity emphasizing instead Black people's statelessness, their movability, and their malleability. Now, the Cotton Kingdom was premised on the value proposition that an extreme amount of disease risk was worth the potentially vast rewards, both for white individuals and the United States writ large. People were willing to take on an extreme amount of epidemiological risk for economic and social security. Now, equating survival with morality justified the exploitation of unacclimated white people and all Black people. It also made New Orleans an unequal and asymmetrical and deeply miserable place to live for the majority of its inhabitants. Now, COVID-19 has had this sort of uncanny ability to lay bare who belongs in our societies and even which lives matter the most. COVID, of course, is a lot less fatal than yellow fever. And while we have a vaccine on the horizon, we are still going to be living with COVID-19 and disease risk for quite some time. So in the United States, many poor people, disproportionately people of color, do not have the option to stay home and work. They do not have the option to limit disease risk, nor do they necessarily have other employment options or recourse with their employers. So the worst case scenario is that people are essentially forced to take on disease risk to get and keep their jobs, to support their families, and pay rent. That is not good policy. It's an invitation to introduce more inequality and suffering into our system. So let's take a lesson from the past and not allow this pandemic and notions of immunity to further exacerbate our pre-existing social, racial, and economic inequalities. We have been there before, and we do not need to go back. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kathryn. David, do you? Yeah.
And I'm unmuted. Okay, good. Well, thank you very much for this invitation to speak. It's great to see so many of my old friends from Israel here on this call. As Kathryn had said, I would much rather be with you there in person. Unfortunately, we need either immunity or better control before that will be possible. And as Kathryn made clear, a large share of the American population so far has been unwilling to take control seriously, forcing us to rely on these notions of immunity. Now, as she explained, this rhetoric of immunity has a very deep history in the United States, going back into these epidemics of yellow fever in the 19th century and these notions of race or race privilege or acclimatization providing some form of immunoprivilege. And that history actually sets up quite well the talk I'll be giving. I'll be focused briefly on the specific history of herd immunity, which is a concept that has been in the news so often over the past few months, and this question of what is or is not an appropriate way to achieve the kind of immunocapital that Kathryn has described. So everyone, of course, loves the idea of immunity, not just in the setting of disease, but in many spheres of life. And it sounds like having a superpower, whether you're immune to disease or immune to attacks or immune from anything else. There's a political discourse on immunity in both Israel and the United States, and that the leaders of both of these countries, Trump and Netanyahu, seek immunity from prosecution for various sins that they are accused of. That kind of immunity is a state of power and privilege. But in practice, it's almost never been, or immunity has almost never been the blessed state that people want it to be. Trump will presumably soon lose his immunity to prosecution. Immunity to disease is often partial and temporary. Boris Johnson, who had COVID last spring, is worried enough about his own recent re-exposure that he has gone back into self-quarantine. Scientists continue to study and debate whether COVID confers any persistent immunity at all, and if it does, how long that lasts. And there have already been several well-documented cases of people getting COVID twice. And the question that we are all very much interested in is whether those cases are anomalous or the norm. And the problem is we just do not yet know. Now, despite such awareness of the likely limits of COVID immunity, the dream of immunity persists. And this is best seen in the case of herd immunity. I will provide a very brief history of this idea of herd immunity and of its manifestations during COVID. And this is work that I did with anthropologist Stefan Helmreich at MIT that we had published in Lancet a few weeks ago. We thought at the time that we were doing this work that this notion of herd immunity was fading from view and would only be of historic interest, but it was revitalized once again in October in the controversies about the Great Barrington Declaration. I don't know how much of this news reached Israel, but it caused quite a stir in both England and the United States. So I hope that this history that I tell will complement the talk that Kathryn just gave and then fuel a rich discussion to follow. And so the COVID history here is that as countries around the world recognized the magnitude of the COVID-19 pandemic in March, some seemed to put their faith in herd immunity. UK pandemic advisor Graham Medley, for instance, said that we are going to have to generate what we call herd immunity, something that would require a nice big epidemic. When the idea received furious criticism, British officials denied that herd immunity had ever been part of their plan. Sweden took its own run at herd immunity in the spring, prompting mathematician Marcus Carlson to object. We are being herded like a flock of sheep towards disaster. Sweden did indeed seem to try a policy of herd immunity, but has shifted course in various ways in response to much higher mortality experienced in Sweden compared to other Scandinavian countries. The idea, however, remained in public discourse throughout the summer, prompting in August Michael Ryan, a senior official at World Health Organization, to warn journalists that we are nowhere close to the levels of immunity required to stop this disease transmitting. We need to focus on what we can actually do now to suppress transmission and not live in hope of herd immunity being our salvation. But this, of course, did not end the debate. In late August, media sources in the United States revealed that the White House might be pondering a policy of herd immunity, forcing officials to issue a prompt denial. Now, the appeal of herd immunity is easy to understand. If it is reached, an epidemic ends. But the illness and death such an approach would require have prompted a strong backlash. Part of the issue, we believe, is that the language of herd immunity itself is part of the problem. A herd usually describes domesticated animals, especially livestock. Herd animals like cows, goats, or sheep are sacrificed for human consumption. Few humans want to be part of that kind of a herd. So how did herd immunity ever enter the language of public health? The phrase seems to have first appeared in the work of American livestock veterinarians concerned about the problem of contagious abortion, epidemics of spontaneous miscarriage that happened in cattle and sheep and had been described since the 18th century. This affliction of contagious abortion was traced to a bacterial cause that we now call brucellosis in the 1890s. By the 1910s, contagious abortion had become the leading contagious threat to cattle in the United States. Farmers typically responded by destroying or selling affected cows. But in the 1910s, Kansas veterinarian George Potter realized that this was exactly the wrong approach. Writing in 1916 in the Journal of the American Veterinary Medical Association, he envisioned what he called herd immunity. As he explained in 1918, abortion disease may be likened to a fire, which, if new fuel is not constantly added, soon dies down. Herd immunity is developed, therefore, by retaining the immune cows, raising the calves, and avoiding the introduction of foreign cattle. Potter's concept of herd immunity reached England in 1917 and again in 1920 in summaries of his publications that were glossed in the British journals, Veterinary Review and Scottish Agriculture. It arrived at a crucial moment. Armies and navies had struggled against infectious disease throughout World War I. Influenza then devastated populations worldwide in 1918. Motivated by these shocks, medical professionals worked to identify and treat pathogens and also to understand their population ecology. How was it that pathogen virulence and population resistance drove the rise and fall of epidemic waves? In July 1919, The Lancet published an article by bacteriologist W.W.C. Topley, who described a series of experimental epidemics he had created in groups of mice. As he reported, unless there was a steady influx of susceptible mice into the population, the rising prevalence of immune individuals would bring the epidemic to an end. In a 1923 article in the Journal of Hygiene, he and his collaborator described this phenomenon as herd immunity. The idea quickly moved into human health. In 1922, Topley had suggested a parallel between outbreaks that he could conduct in laboratory mice and outbreaks that occurred spontaneously in human children. As he wrote, such a likeness would seem to exist in the case of epidemic diseases affecting children of school age. He also wondered whether you could learn from livestock medicine and develop programs that could be useful in schools. He wondered whether measures already in vogue in dealing with epidemics among the livestock, where methods of segregation are so much more easily enforced than among human populations, might inform decisions about how to manage school closings during epidemics. Topley's musings about the relation between mice and human epidemics soon found their test. In 1923, Sheldon Dudley, a professor of pathology at the Royal Naval Medical School, became aware of epidemics of diphtheria at the Royal Hospital School in Greenwich, London. The school provided laboratory-like conditions, with a homogeneous group of male students in good physical health who were entered into the school in batches several times a year. In the school, they slept in large dormitories with as many as 70 to 125 beds in a single room. Dudley realized that these conditions created a useful analogy to the laboratory models that Topley had developed with mice. So Dudley studied these students and complemented his data with studies from the Grand Fleet during World War I and from the training ship, the HMS Impregnable, which proved to be grievously susceptible to epidemics. Dudley published reports for the British Medical Research Council on diphtheria, on scarlet fever, on droplet infections more generally, and on the role of immunization in controlling diphtheria outbreaks. He believed that Topley's analysis of experimental epidemics amongst communities of mice provides at more than one point striking parallels to the observed phenomena among the boys at Greenwich. In 1924, in an article in The Lancet, Dudley applied herd immunity to humans. And if you look at Dudley's writing, he often wrote about human herds in ways that are quite jarring to modern ears. In a 1929 article, Human Adaptation to the Parasitic Environment, he wrote, "I will now consider the community, or the herd. Nations, human nations, may be divided into urban or rural herds, or we can contrast the shore-going herd with a sailor herd, or the herds dwelling in hospitals can be compared with those who live in mental hospitals." Now, Dudley's glide from the animal to the human drew on established British traditions of animal symbolism. As historian Harriet Ritvo, who was Shearer's advisor in graduate school, argues in The Animal Estate, animals have long served in England as figures for representing different national types, lineages, and identities. When Dudley, as a surgeon, researcher, and medical administrator, wrote about the English herd, he tacitly invoked his own role in this project of national stewardship. Dudley's language, however, did give some readers pause. When he published his 1934 report on diphtheria immunization, he prefaced the report with a pair of photographs. One photograph showing the human herd showed the Greenwich boys eating dinner. Another photograph, the bacterial herd, showed colonies of diphtheria growing on culture plates. As a commentator, a book reviewer in The Lancet noted, anyone with a modern sense of social progress might well wonder whether the phrase, the human herd, is here used in a scientific or an ironical sense. But perhaps in this case, the meanings are not that far apart. Such concerns about this language of human herds notwithstanding, the concept of herd immunity quickly became a fixture of epidemiology by the 1930s. Discussions of herd immunity for influenza, for polio, for smallpox, and typhoid appeared in textbooks, journals, and public health reports in England, Australia, and the United States. The idea also intersected with eugenic notions of racial difference, of the sort that Kathryn had described, at a time when eugenic racism was ascendant in both England and the United States. An author of a 1931 piece in Lancet, for instance, wondered whether specific groups, for instance the Maori, had racial herd immunity. Now, one thing that's frustrating is that these early researchers never settled on a clear definition of what they meant by herd immunity. Dudley preferred a narrow focus on what share of a herd had acquired resistance from natural exposure or immunization. That's quite close to the modern meanings. Topley, however, elaborated a more expansive concept. As he explained in the Journal of the Royal Army Medical Corps in 1935, herd immunity encompassed not just the distribution of immunity, but also the social factors that determined the herd's exposure. So in this case, the English herd, those people living in England, had herd immunity to plague, malaria, and typhus because they no longer lived in close association with the necessary disease vectors. Now, this concept of herd immunity took on fresh prominence in the 1950s and 1960s as new vaccines raised crucial questions for public health policy. Researchers wanted to know what share of a population had to be vaccinated to control or eradicate a disease. And the idea surged again after 1990 as public health officials in many countries worked to achieve sufficient levels of vaccine coverage in the face of rising anti-vaccination sentiment. But the language of herd immunity continued to resonate with visions of people being treated as animals to be domesticated and culled. Anxieties long reflected in dystopian science fiction about farmed humans, whether in H.G. Wells' Time Machine or David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas, or many Hollywood movies that have involved farming of humans. This association between livestock and sacrifice might have contributed to the objections last March to policies that would have asked many people to agree to be sickened or killed by SARS-CoV-2 in pursuit of herd immunity. But despite the concerns that surfaced last spring, the phrase has not at all disappeared. The public now faces the same problems with COVID-19 in 2020 that Dudley had faced with diphtheria in the 1920s, whether a contagious droplet infection can be controlled without a vaccine or therapeutic through social distancing and hygiene alone. Studies in June and July had initially cast doubt on prospects for herd immunity. Despite months of exposure, antibody surveys had found a low seroprevalence, less than 10% in cities in Spain and Switzerland. Commentators in The Lancet concluded that, in light of these findings, any proposed approach to achieve herd immunity through natural infection is not only highly unethical, but also unachievable. Skeptics also raised other concerns, observing, for instance, that other coronaviruses induce only transient antibody defenses in humans. Defenders of herd immunity, however, have persisted. Some argue that antibodies are not essential because SARS-CoV-2 might induce durable T-cell immunity. Others speculate that if the most susceptible members of a community are infected first, then herd immunity might be achieved after just 20% of the population has been exposed. These ideas received their latest incarnation in the Great Barrington Declaration, issued with great fanfare on October 4th. Several researchers, including one at Harvard, proposed dividing our community into two groups, those who are vulnerable to serious effects from COVID and those who were not. They recommended that people who were not vulnerable, especially the people who are young and healthy, be allowed to go about their business as usual. The virus would then run its course through those populations and generate herd immunity, at which point the epidemic would dissipate. Meanwhile, those who were vulnerable, such as the elderly or those with pre-existing conditions, could be locked away in some mode of protective custody. Over 175,000 signatories lent their support to this declaration. The whole effort, however, soon descended into a farce. Most people realized that the proposal was unworkable. First, no one is not vulnerable to COVID. Even though serious illness in young adults is rare, it does happen. An uncontrolled epidemic would take a serious toll from those not vulnerable people. Second, there would be no practical way to protect the vulnerable while providing them with any kind of meaningful existence. Third, it soon became clear that the whole enterprise had been funded by a libertarian think tank, funded by oil companies, tobacco companies, and the Koch brothers. And then fourth, it turns out that some share of the signatories proved to be jokes, including Mr. Bananarama, Dr. Johnny Fartpants, Dr. Person Fake Name, Professor Nadaf Akinklu, and in honor of the English, Professor Cominic Dummings. Now here we sit, with good news today from my colleagues at Harvard and MIT who are responsible for the vaccine at Moderna Pharmaceuticals. There is news coming out that vaccines may help us in this epidemic, but widespread distribution of these is still many months away. Meanwhile, lockdowns and social distancing cause social and economic disruption. People have realized that there are no ideal options. British public health expert Raj Bhopal likened the situation to being in a zugzwang, a position in chess where every move is disadvantageous and where we must examine every plan, however unpalatable. He sought to overcome the animal connotations of herd immunity by encouraging the use of the different phrase, population immunity. Now, changing the label of herd immunity might remove the connotations, but it would not fix the problem. Without a vaccine, many people will have to die and get sick from COVID-19 before population immunity is achieved. Unfortunately, this is the gamble that the United States government now seems to be taking. Whether because of a true commitment to the idea of herd immunity, even though they continue to deny it, or whether out of anger at having lost the election, the Trump administration has offered no response to the current surge of COVID cases and deaths. It has even continued to call on citizens of the various states to rise up against public health measures implemented at the state level. For instance, Scott Atlas is encouraging the residents of Michigan to rise up against their governor. COVID-19 mortality in England and the United States has already taken a disproportionate toll on the poor and minority groups, a reflection of systemic racism and poverty. At one urgent care center in a largely Latino working class neighborhood in New York City, named remarkably Corona, 68.4% of antibody tests came back positive in July, a testimony to how widespread this epidemic has become in certain groups. But it remains unclear whether these antibodies will protect individuals or generate herd immunity. Until there exist vaccines that can do both of those things and can be distributed widely, societies will need to continue to try to control the spread of the virus at the local level through public health measures and community action to protect the most vulnerable people, to save lives, and to support public health and medical systems. We should not simply put our faith in the immunity of our herd. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shiva.
I think we can open it for questions now.
Okay, so we can open the floor for questions. I guess there are many questions because these are everyone has, of course, some kind of opinion about these issues. I saw Nadav, but Nevo, please first.
Can you hear me? This one is for Kathryn. I have two small historical questions. The first one is about Louisiana. You mentioned a bunch of legal procedures that were taken against the non-accommodated population, which included appropriation and restriction to the right of vote and such and such. And I just wondered, how did the judiciary, especially federal judiciary, respond to such actions, because they do violate the federal constitution, whether it's equal standing or interstate commerce and such, which is quite interesting if no injunction was ever given against the state of Louisiana or the city of New Orleans, or whether there were some injunctions. And the second point is, well, after the Civil War, during the Reconstruction era, you mentioned how Boston invested a lot of public health. The South was governed by radical Republicans and Republicans from the North, who brought different ideas and notions about everything. So how did the methods of discrimination as you described persisted well after the Reconstruction era, and when freed slaves and carpetbaggers took control over Southern institutions? Or did it affect at all? Did something change during the Reconstruction? Maybe after the 1876 compromise, things deteriorated back. I don't know.
So those are two excellent questions. To the first question about how did the federal government respond to this, especially in impinging upon people's rights? So this is an era predating, before the Civil War, there was no 14th Amendment, which meant, so some of the rights that later the federal government sort of established for all citizens were not yet established until the late 1860s, after the Civil War. The federal government there's a very tricky thing that's happening between state, local, municipal government in New Orleans and the federal government. Essentially, the federal government before the Civil War ceded all power for public health to the state government, which in turn devolved that to New Orleans, which is where the state government sat before the capital moved to Baton Rouge later in the 19th century. So New Orleans, so basically things like quarantine, head taxes on incoming vessels, all of these questions were to be set by politicians in New Orleans, not by state officials and not by the federal government. There were no it could have been possible that cases could have gone before the Supreme Court potentially, or to the national government, but they never were. No question about public health and about the rights of undocumented people went to the Supreme Court, or indeed any other federal court, until very late in the 19th century. The other question you asked about what happened during Reconstruction. So, for those of you a very brief crash course in American history. So in 1861, America started a civil war. So this is the South. They seceded from the larger nation. And then 4 years later, this question of the Civil War was ended, and slavery was abolished thereafter. And after the war, the South was largely occupied militarily by federal troops. So there's a couple really interesting things about this. So New Orleans experienced its first significant decline in mortality in its entire history in the 1860s during the Civil War itself. This is when the Union Army occupied New Orleans and they instituted a strict quarantine, the first time that a quarantine had really ever been established and actually upheld in New Orleans. So there were basically no deaths from yellow fever. Mortality became basically the normal national average during those 4 years of war. Thereafter, many of the new rulers who had been installed by the federal government, Republicans, this is the party of Abraham Lincoln, they did bring different ideas about public health. And you see some sort of action towards trying to clean up the city, to install waterworks, to install more quarantines, to bulk up, as it were, the quarantine station there. And this did sort of work, but locals did fight back against this. So the slaughterhouse cases, which are very famous, this is one of the most famous cases that basically tested the extent of the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed equal protection to all citizens under federal law. This is the first test case that really diminished the rights that was sort of challenged the extent of these rights. And this was all brought over the placement of a slaughterhouse and notions of public health. And in fact, locals won on this question. And this is the slaughterhouse cases, and many historians consider them to be the sort of first major breakdown of Reconstruction. And the year that Reconstruction ended, so this is when federal troops were removed from the South, and the South went back to what was called home rule, ruled again by the people who had seceded, the Confederates who had seceded from the nation in 1861. The sort of return to home rule and the end of Reconstruction coincided with another terrible epidemic of yellow fever. In 1878 was one of the worst epidemics, and not the second worst epidemic in American history, with 20,000 people dead across the entire the sort of larger region. And this was taken as a sign. In fact, people in the North took this as a sign that that the war, that the South was inherently corrupt, that it couldn't rule itself, and basically they ceded responsibility. Federal government ceded responsibility for public health once again to the South.
Thank you, Kathryn. Nadav?
Thank you both. This was amazing. David, I was teaching today medical students. I used your article. We're also writing a response from the Association of Schools of Public Health about the issue of herd immunity. And I think taking both of your scholarship presented today, I think it's a great example how history of medicine, public health can also inform in a good way current discussions. I want to ask both of you, or maybe it's more a comment, and I wonder because herd immunity can be used in many different ways by many different people. I mean, it's like with resistance to vaccination, that very interestingly you can see it both on the right and the left. In Israel, for example, herd immunity was used by ultra-Orthodox, saying that maybe now we have a large ultra-Orthodox city in Israel called Bnei Brak. They're saying that maybe they can continue and learn Torah because they achieved the herd immunity. On the other hand, it's used by libertarians as you mentioned. But I think that from my perspective, it's mainly the ethical question of how finally issues of how it can reinforce socioeconomic inequalities and finally something that can be presented as a scientific claim, and maybe having inside some important aspect. I think, Kathryn, you started with it, because I can really sympathize with all the consequences of lockdown, and then it's being used, and actually it's based on previous racial and ideological claims. So what I'm saying that it's very differentiated. It's not my question, more a comment. And I think it's very different also in different countries. I think it can be a great option for having it analyzed, how it's being used. I mean, for example, the ultra-Orthodox use, I think it's quite different from what you presented. So thank you. It was fascinating.
And just one comment about that. The basic issue is how to get these epidemics under control. And at least in the U.S., there's been a perceived choice between getting the epidemic under control through social restrictions or through immunity of some sort. And there's just been a totally defeatist attitude in the United States about the ability of social practices to bring this under control, despite the fact that has been now done by many, many countries. I think most countries in this world. I have a student in my graduate seminar this fall who's taking a class from Beijing. In Beijing, a city of 20 million people, is essentially back to normal. The movie theaters are full, the grocery stores are full, the restaurants are full. The price you pay is continuous surveillance. You can't go in or out of a building without showing your smartphone. But they're living a normal life. I've been having a regular correspondence with Warwick Anderson in Sydney all the way through the epidemic. And he just took a big victory lap this weekend, sending me all the newspaper coverage of the end of the lockdowns in Australia and these scenes of mass public celebration. So it's clear that can be done. But the U.S. has chosen not to do that in a serious way. And in some ways, there's an ethical choice there. What are the stakes of these various policies for the different kinds of people? The federal government has completely put its faith in these vaccines. It may be that faith will be rewarded. But there's so many things that aren't considered seriously in this vaccine faith. So one is, how will you distribute these vaccines in a way that doesn't exacerbate disparities? That is a huge concern. I haven't seen any serious proposals for doing that. Some people have said we should give the vaccines first to the Black and brown communities in the United States because those are the ones who are highest risk. I can't imagine that's the way the policy is actually going to go for a number of different reasons. And then meanwhile, there's this huge problem with the anti-vax sentiment. Most of the current polls show that only 50% of Americans will accept a vaccine. And initially, people had been quite pessimistic. They said, well, if the vaccine is only half effective and only half the people accept it, you're down to 25% of herd immunity. That's not very useful. If Moderna and Pfizer are right, that the vaccines are actually 90 to 95% effective, if only half the population takes that actually is still a substantial level of protection. Will it be enough or not? I don't think we really know. And again, as Anav had said, quickly you'll see people saying, well, if herd immunity is high enough, then I don't need to get vaccinated. And so in some sense, the success of herd immunity will then just foster more anti-vaccination sentiment. And then you add in the curveball of what if the immunity wanes after 4 months or 5 months? It's just really hard to know how much faith we should have in the herd immunity, whether achieved through mass exposure or through a vaccine.
Yeah, there are a few more people. Snaith, please.
Unmute, Snaith, unmute.
So I want to ask two questions. One is more conceptual and one is more historical. I'll start with the conceptual one. Last year I took part in a workshop on plasticity in medicine. And one of the participants came from Czechoslovakia, actually from Czechia. And one of the things that she talked about, which came out very clearly, is that the notion of any kind of immunity which is not personalized, individualized, is totally politicized under certain regimes because it is connected with the notion of collectivity. And that, let's put it not just collectivity, but a repressive collectivity, no matter what the repression is for, even for herd immunity. So this is something that when you talk about using the notion of herd immunity or not using it or how you use it, I think you have to contextualize it, both to particular societies and to political regimes. That's one question, how you do that. The other question is, can you see any kind of connection between using the notion of herd immunity and eugenical conceptions that were very, very prominent during those years, the early 19th century, 20th century, even until the 40s and the 50s in the United States, even later. And in some sense, I wasn't really surprised that Sweden went the way it did, because Sweden really promoted eugenic notions till the 70s. So how do you connect these things?
David, would you like to go first?
Sure. I'll give a quick answer because I'm curious to hear what Kathryn would say about this. The notion of collective is totally fascinating. The Trump administration is not a collectivist administration. It's very much pursue your own self-interest, whatever the consequences may be. And you can see that now in the response to the election results. And so in some way, for them to put so much faith in this notion of herd immunity, which is really a call for collective action and suffering in the name of the public good, seems perverse in some way. I didn't really know what to think about that until I was listening to Kathryn's comments this morning, in which case, in the 19th century, there was a much more individualized notion of immunity. Like getting immunity was something that you do as an individual, and then you can marketize in some way and commercialize in some way and make money through this notion of immunocapital. And so I've been, sort of reprocessing my thoughts about the Trump administration, wondering if that is a partial explanation for the popularity amongst herd immunity in the libertarian elements in this country. The official story has been, the libertarians are concerned about the economic damage of lockdowns, and so therefore you need to go for herd immunity, despite its collectivist undertones. But maybe there's something else going on here as well, and that if what they're really doing is channeling their 19th century predecessors and seeing immunity as an individual achievement, an individual privilege, and again, very much in a survival of the fittest kind of way. All the proponents of herd immunity admit that there will be damage as you do this. Some percentage of the people will die. They don't state explicitly, and then the healthiest will survive, but the fittest will survive. I think that's implicit. And again, and as Kathryn had pointed out, that becomes very clear in Trump's rhetoric after he got sick, when seemingly, heavily medicated with steroids and getting on the steroid euphoria from that, he came out as if he was a Superman. He hadn't felt better for 20 years. He was now immune. He didn't need to wear masks. And so it was a very individualistic notion of immunity.
Yeah. So I think you've summarized, if I could tape record you saying that and, play it back for when I'm redoing my revision of my book, I would use that. I think that's precisely right. Immunity was not seen as a collective endeavor. I don't think they didn't have the concept necessarily of herd immunity, that through mass exposure, the problem could be solved writ large. They sort of did understand, they did have a concept that they called, actually in the 19th century, yellow fever, the stranger's disease. They understood that people who were not from Louisiana, people who had not lived in the tropics for some time, people who had not survived this disease were especially vulnerable. But this, I think David said this very well, which is that immunity was seen as very much a sort of individual endeavor, that it was your risk to take on, and your rewards, if you survived. And there was nothing to mediate that in between. And this is an era, the mid-19th century. This is an era when, of course, Darwin and various sort of evolutionary theories are coming to the fore. You have the sort of notion that, the survival of the fittest is on people's minds. And, you sort of see this in their rhetoric all the time, which is that, you see politicians, you see mayors of New Orleans, you see some of the most powerful people in New Orleans and in Louisiana saying essentially, nobody's asking you to come here, unless you were enslaved and you're being forced. If you were a free person, you're making this choice to come here. It's not our job to help you sort of stay healthy or avoid this disease. In fact, it's your job to become sick, and then thereafter we will help you make money through slavery, through cotton, through sugar, etc. But it's very much this. It bristles against a sort of a modern sensibility, of course, of public health, which is that, in public health essentially is the subordination of individual rights for the collective good. And it sort of takes this of course goes against many American sort of professed preferences, where they sort of tout liberties as sort of these individual rights to, it's their ability to make money, to engage in the market, to carry a gun, et cetera, that, their sort of being does not impact other people. We're sort of an anti-collectivist culture in this respect. And I think that there is, I think there are very strong connections to this kind of ultra-libertarian, ultra-hands-off approach that it is one's personal responsibility to sort of determine their own personal risk assessment. And this is a phrase that we hear all the time in the United States. Sort of, what is your own, personal risk tolerance? Which is a phrase that I hate to hear, especially now. And I live in, I was thinking when we were talking about vaccine hesitancy, I live in Silicon Valley, and this is one of, there's a lot of anti-vaxxers live here. I speak to them and they say they won't take the vaccine. They say, it's absolutely, they'll be protected by other people. And if they get it, so be it. They do yoga, they drink green juice, they'll survive, they're healthy. That's very much the sort of attitude. So, and it sort of also cuts across the sort of political spectrum in really fascinating ways, this sort of vaccine hesitancy. So I think there is a very strong connection to this. It's disturbingly strong connection to the kind of attitudes that I see from 200 years ago that are still playing out 200, today, and in the highest, by Trump himself.
And what about eugenics? What do you think there? Can you see any connection in the 20th century to eugenical mode of thinking rather than to specific ideas?
I think if you were willing to go to extremes of cynicism, then you could say, how can you explain the absence of federal action against COVID? Well, because it's killing people that the federal government doesn't care about.
Well, it's certainly true for Brazil.
Mm. And so, maybe that is what's going on. I hope that's not the case. But again, it's impossible to rule anything out. What depths will the administration sink to? Seems to be pretty deep.
And I would add to this, I think, this is for today as well, but I think, many people, many poor people, many Black and brown people in the United States are sort of convinced that there is a kind of, not necessarily an organized conspiracy per se by the federal government to, delay a vaccine or to, not control the virus, but that it's, that the federal government is essentially happy with the people that it is impacting the most. This is when you talk to people who live in Philadelphia or New York City in certain neighborhoods, in Corona even too, this neighborhood in New York City, this is, some people have, become convinced that the federal government's lack of action is, very much by design, and that they are, if not happy, at least quite complacent with the people that this disease is impacting the most.
I think that there is a difference still between eugenics from one side and killing the people you don't care of. It's not the same thing.
No,
so
but
you could be. No, I just say about the answers that it's not the same to think that we don't care of these people and that our nation will be better.
But using the notion of herd immunity in England and in Sweden is really it resonates like some kind of a faraway eugenic mode of thinking.
Yeah. I want to have two comments, a comment and two comments. One is that there is a very interesting differences in the discourse about COVID in different states, and especially with the political implications, because the implications in Israel are very different, and the connection with the right left is almost the other way around. Like it's the extreme measures are those who place for the hands of Netanyahu in this case. It's also Netanyahu is very much in question of science. Netanyahu is very much non-Trump. Is with science in general, and that's I think. But it's also different in Europe, where you have a welfare state and different places. So I think it's one. But and I want to have another question, which is question or question, and this is about the way that, especially in your talk, David, you use about immunity as kind of a dichotomy. So you have either you are immune or not immune. And there are very few things which are really dichotomy. So it's true in the personal case. The individual is there can perhaps be strong enough for some kind of doses from outside, but not for the others. And of course, for what we call the herd immunity or the group immunity, which is the Latin phrase, which is perhaps better in this case. So if you want to comment about that.
That's one of the things, one of the problems with immunity or the immune system in general is it's just so complicated. It's hard to have a sophisticated public discourse about anything involving the immune system. And one of the best examples of this that you see in the US literature is the tremendous confusion that exists between sickle cell disease and malaria. And you'll see asserted time and time again in medical textbooks, epidemiology textbooks, history textbooks, that people who have sickle cell trait are immune from malaria. And that just colors the whole discourse of that. And nothing could be further from the truth. I think the best estimates are that if you are a carrier of sickle cell disease, you have a 10% improved survival for some forms of malaria. Now, over 10,000 years of human history, that has altered gene frequencies. Natural selection in some cases does do something. But it's a huge overstatement to say that you are immune to malaria. But that has been a persistent confusion. Kathryn described the overstated faith that African Americans were immune to yellow fever in some ways, or in Trump's overstated faith that he is now immune to COVID. Boris Johnson clearly doesn't think that's the case. And so people do want to have it as a dichotomous variable. And you see the parallel discussion in the Great Barrington Declaration, dividing the world into vulnerable and not vulnerable, as if everyone is in one of those two states, which is just so far from what the situation actually is. The problem is if epidemiologists or historians' response to all this is to say, well, it's really more complicated, you need more nuance. No one wants to hear that. Reporters don't want to hear that. Politicians don't want to hear that. So there are all these forces that are trying to simplify a very complex topic. And any policy built on those simplifications just is not going to work well.
Yeah. So I think we have time for the last question. Ehud, sorry. So perhaps it will be two, but Ehud?
Yeah, so thank you both for two very interesting talks. I want to push a little further a theme that I think came up in Nadav and Snape's question. So when you talk about whether it's herd immunity or population immunity, you immediately evoke the question of the boundaries of the herd or the population. And I think this is something that didn't explicitly come up until now. So who are you afraid of, right? It's not my dog. So a theme that, for example, was very prevalent during the AIDS epidemic was, when you have sexual relations with someone, you are in danger of being infected by the people that person had sexual relations with, and so on and so forth. And here, when you talk about a herd, say in Israel, Nadav mentioned the ultra-Orthodox, but you can think about a brown population working in meat packing in the United States or something like that. Are they part of our herd? Are they part of our population? These questions are implicit in this discussion, and that takes us to the opposite sort of set of concerns in terms of you're not really interested in their agency and whatnot, as came up in Kathryn's talk, because regardless of that, if you're in danger of being sick because of what someone else's does, they immediately become part of the population that concerns you. So this theme is implicit, but it's so implicit that it's almost not there. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, either in the historical case or today.
Yeah, I would just say very briefly that notion of what counts as the community is a huge issue in the U.S. and is part of the discrepancy in federal and state policy. The federal government is very much saying this is an issue for states, and governors can decide what they want to do for their own communities, although they then turn around and then undermine state and city-based efforts. But the concern that a lot of the epidemiologists have, is heard a great interview yesterday with Michael Mina, who's at the School of Public Health. The fear is if you have a fully regionalized policy in the U.S., one region will stamp out COVID, but then it'll circulate in another region, and the virus will just go around and around and around the country. The country is big enough to sustain indefinite propagation of the virus unless there was a concerted nationwide lockdown. And so, yes, New England could get its act together and control COVID, as we did in the spring. But that's pointless in the long run, as long as different communities in the country are behaving differently. And there's just no stomach right now to declare the whole country to be the community and the object of action. And that's going to have to change if we're going to get this under control.
And I was going to say, in response to your question too, that this is precisely this point, which is that it's one of the problems with the United States is this federal system, in that 50 states establishing their own public health responses to a virus really is it's like putting a Band-Aid on a geyser or something. It doesn't have any salutary effect. And even more than that too, I think so much of health, the ways that people are interacting with public health and thinking about this is not even at the state level, but at their much more local level, their municipal level, where even a lot of sort of powers have been devolved to mayors or city councils, especially in the American South. Now, where you see this a lot, where mayors are, in states that don't have mask mandates or don't have lockdown orders in the summer, they were, trying to, they were filing lawsuits trying to close down restaurants within city limits in Birmingham, Alabama, for example, or other places. So that's, for, as we're talking about the sort of, for a country in which individual rights are paramount, the sort of notion of like who's in the herd and who's in your herd is almost, it's, the metaphors don't match almost. And I'm going to think about your question more about this historically too, about who was sort of excluded from the body politic, or thinking of, who was excluded from the community on the basis of this notion of sort of who has immunity, who doesn't.
I think with this, this be the time for to close this meeting. It's thank you very much for these two interesting talks. And we really hope next time to have you here in person, and not only through the Zoom. And that will be, but at least we have the opportunity that it's easier to have these discussions. But as I say, we hope to have you here. And thank you everyone for the discussion.